Prime Minister, what do you make of the Trump administration's meetings with Alberta separatists and the comments of Secretary Bessent? Is this foreign interference from the U.S.?
The governments that are going to make a difference to Canada, to Alberta, to Canada, are at this table, I guess alongside with municipalities and working with our Indigenous partners. And the focus of the meeting last night, today, the meeting of the Council of Federation before that, was how we come together and build, how we build a better country, how we build safer communities.
It didn't start with tariffs, insults, or tough talk across podiums. It started quietly, behind the scenes, and that is exactly why it set off alarms in Ottawa. Reports that figures linked to the Trump administration had engaged with Alberta separatist groups marked a sharp and unsettling shift in the tone of U.S.-Canada relations, crossing from familiar diplomatic friction into something far more sensitive: alleged interference in Canada's internal political fabric. For a relationship long defined by shared borders, deep economic ties, and mutual respect for sovereignty, the implications were immediate and serious, raising questions not just about intent, but about how far one ally should ever go in testing another's unity. The timing of the reported meetings only intensified the concern. They surfaced during a period already strained by trade disputes, protectionist rhetoric, and broader uncertainty in the global economy. Canada and the United States were navigating disagreements over tariffs, supply chains, and industrial policy, all against a backdrop of rising geopolitical tension worldwide. In that environment, even symbolic gestures can take on outsized meaning. Engagement with separatist movements, particularly in a province as economically significant as Alberta, was viewed by many Canadian officials and analysts as a deliberate escalation, or at the very least a reckless move that ignored long-standing diplomatic norms between allies. When asked to respond, Mark Carney chose his words with notable precision. Rather than naming or addressing the separatist groups directly, he reframed the conversation entirely. He spoke instead about the real work of governance already underway among Canada's legitimate decision-makers: federal leaders, provincial governments, municipal authorities, and Indigenous nations. By doing so, Carney avoided granting fringe movements the attention or legitimacy they often seek. His response suggested that Canada's political future is shaped through established democratic institutions, not informal conversations with external actors. This approach was widely interpreted as deliberate and strategic. By refusing to engage the separatists head-on, Carney denied them oxygen. There was no fiery denunciation that could be clipped and shared online, no rhetorical escalation that might amplify their message. Instead, he emphasized continuity, cooperation, and institutional strength. The message was subtle but firm. Canada's democracy is not fragmented, and it does not require commentary or validation from outside powers. That restraint, however, did not signal weakness. On the contrary, Carney's comments carried an unmistakable undertone of resolve. By grounding his response in Canada's existing governance structures, he reinforced the idea that the country's unity is maintained not by suppressing dissent, but by ensuring that decisions are made through inclusive, constitutional processes. In doing so, he also drew a clear line between legitimate political debate within Canada and unacceptable external involvement. The controversy escalated further as comments from U.S. officials entered the public sphere. Suggestions, some framed casually, others more pointed, that Alberta could align with or even join the United States were met with disbelief and anger across much of Canada. Even if intended as rhetorical flourishes, such remarks struck many as profoundly disrespectful. For Canadians, sovereignty is not a talking point or a bargaining chip. It is a foundational principle. Any implication that Canada's borders or internal cohesion are negotiable touches a nerve that runs deep in the national consciousness. Carney addressed this head-on with a clear assertion of sovereignty. Canada's internal political decisions, he said, belong to Canadians alone. The statement was calm, but its meaning was unmistakable. Allies may disagree, negotiate, and even clash over policy, but there are boundaries that must be respected. Interfering, directly or indirectly, in another nation's internal political debates crosses one of those boundaries. Importantly, Carney did not treat the issue as a matter for sound bites alone. He confirmed that the situation would be elevated through formal diplomatic channels. Canada's representatives in Washington and the U.S. ambassador in Ottawa would be engaged, ensuring that concerns were addressed state to state rather than through media back and forth. This move underscored the seriousness with which Ottawa views the matter. By shifting it into official diplomacy, Canada signaled that alleged engagement with separatist movements is not a minor misstep, but a potential violation of trust between allies. The response from former political leaders added further weight to the issue. Brian Gallant, former Premier of New Brunswick, was among those who condemned the reported meetings in stark terms, calling them completely unacceptable. He drew a pointed comparison, asking how Americans would react if Canada were to engage with separatist movements within the United States. The analogy resonated widely, highlighting what many see as a double standard. Actions that would be considered intolerable if reversed should not be normalized simply because of power dynamics. Across party lines, Canadian leaders emphasized a Team Canada approach. The idea is simple but powerful. Unity is the country's strongest defense against external pressure. By presenting a cohesive front, Canada removes the leverage that might otherwise be gained by exploiting internal divisions. This framing transformed the controversy from a regional issue into a national one, reinforcing the notion that sovereignty is a shared responsibility, not a partisan talking point. What stands out in Carney's handling of the situation is the balance he struck between firmness and restraint. There was no public escalation, no retaliatory rhetoric, and no attempt to inflame tensions for political gain. Instead, he set boundaries clearly while leaving room for diplomatic resolution. This containment strategy reflects a broader Canadian approach to foreign policy, measured, principled, and rooted in respect for institutions. At the same time, the episode serves as a reminder of how fragile even long-standing alliances can become when political rhetoric spills into sensitive territory. Engagement with separatist movements is not just provocative, it undermines the basic assumption that allies respect each other's territorial integrity and democratic processes. Once that assumption is shaken, rebuilding trust becomes far more difficult. For Canada, the takeaway is both sobering and galvanizing. The country cannot assume that proximity or history alone will shield it from external pressure. Vigilance, unity, and a willingness to defend sovereignty through both words and institutions remain essential. For the United States, the controversy raises questions about the long-term costs of blurring the line between tough diplomacy and political interference. As this issue moves into formal diplomatic discussions, its outcome will be closely watched, not just in Ottawa and Washington, but in capitals around the world. How Canada and the United States navigate this moment will signal whether the norms that underpin alliances still hold, or whether they are increasingly vulnerable to erosion. What is clear is that Canada has chosen containment over confrontation, unity over outrage, and institutional strength over rhetorical sparring, a response designed not to escalate the moment, but to define its limits. In the end, this episode is less about one set of meetings and more about the principles they test. Sovereignty, mutual respect, and the unwritten rules of alliance behavior are not abstract concepts. They shape how nations coexist in an uncertain world. Canada's response, anchored in calm assertion rather than reaction, reinforces those principles while making it clear that any attempt to exploit internal divisions will be treated as a serious breach. If you want to stay informed on how this story develops and catch more in-depth reports like this, hit the subscribe button for future uploads.